This is Duke University.
Okay, can everybody's attention, please? Hi, my name is Kunal Choksi, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Duke Forum for Law and Social Change. So on behalf of the Forum, Environmental Law Society, and the Human Rights Society, we'd like to welcome you today to our 4th annual symposium. As Duke's newest journal, the Forum for Law and Social Change is dedicated to create an ongoing discussion about one topic a year. Last March, our membership voted for this topic, which is a just transition to a green economy. And ever since then, we've been overwhelmed by the response that we've gotten from scholars, from professors in the law school, from people in the Durham and North Carolina community. And we're really excited today about the people who are coming to speak to us and about people who are writing for our journal issue that will come out later this year. One of those speakers who so generally to offer to open our symposium for us is our very own Dr. Pamela Maxson. She is from Duke's Nicholas School of Environment and is research director of the Children's Environmental Health Initiative. Her work integrates research, education, outreach regarding environmental and social justice disparities. Her research lies in the health disparities and the environmental, societal, familial, and individual influences on health outcomes. And of course, her biggest accomplishment is that she is the mother of 3 teenage boys. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Pamela Maxson. Supposed to push something.
Push something. So my daughter will be very dismayed to find out she just turned into a son. So I have... It's okay. So when they asked me to give a little bio, I've been to so many talks, and people don't really want to hear about me. But at the end of every day, my greatest accomplishment is that I made it through the day with 3 teenagers. And my perspective has definitely changed, because when I had children under 5, 3 children under 5, I would think, oh, I did a dissertation, I defended my dissertation, I have a doctorate, I can deal with these 3 children. Now, when I have a difficult scientific problem, I think, I can solve this, because I get through every single day with 3 teenagers. So it definitely changes your perspective. But I know nothing about IT, so this is all on them.
What's wrong?
No, go back to computer. Ooh, I saw a flash.
Computer. Okay, got it.
Yay. All right, so I want to tell you a little bit about what we did. When Mr. Doyle contacted me to ask to give, can you guys let me know if you can't hear me, because I tend to walk around. I pace a lot. I'm not sure whether it's because, I just have, anyway, never mind. When Mr. Doyle asked me to give opening remarks and sort of talk a little bit about what we do at the Children's Environmental Health Initiative as a scientific basis for your really exciting day today, I thought, okay, we have a multi-million-dollar research program that has multiple projects that cover the entire lifespan, and we deal with all kinds of national and local and state and neighborhood things, and I have to do it in 10 minutes. So from my years of teaching at Duke, I've taught 18 years at Duke, I learned to have a handout. So I gave you a handout. I hope there were enough. I made 50 copies. So that if I talk really fast and you don't get it, you have it on print. And in the very last slide, I put my contact information if you want to contact me and talk further about anything. Okay, so you will notice on the screen that there's a University of Michigan emblem. Our director, Dr. Marilyn Miranda, left Duke in August to become the dean of the School of the Environment in Michigan. So now we are an inter-university research program as well. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do, and I mean really a little bit about what we do, disparities in environmental exposure. Okay, who are we? So we like to say, we call ourselves C-High, and we like to say that we are actually good for you as opposed to high C. So C-High stands for the Children's Environmental Health Initiative, and we started off dealing with children, and now we have gone through the whole lifespan. We focus on social and environmental justice. We emphasize prevention. Of course, sometimes you have to do intervention, but we would prefer to do prevention. We are spatial analytic nerds. I am not. I'm not a nerd. I'm a nerd in other ways. I know nothing about spatial analysis, but I just get the pretty maps that they show me, and I get to talk about them. And we want to make a difference in the world. As corny as that sounds, that is our goal. That is why we go to work every single day. The world may be global, it may be national, it may be state, it may be county, or it may be in our neighborhood. So we have a very broad view. What is our theoretical framework? We believe that you could put yourself in that triangle, that all of us have three forces working on us: our host factors, our social factors, and then environmental factors. None of them are in isolation. Disparities occur when one of these sides of the triangle affect certain populations more than other populations. Okay, so a very brief background on disparities in exposure. Socioeconomically disadvantaged and minority populations more often live in poor neighborhoods. This is not going to be news to you, but it is scientifically founded. They are more likely to live closer to agricultural, industrial, or high-traffic areas. They are more often exposed to environmental contaminants. In addition, they may be more susceptible to these contaminants because they have accumulated risks. They don't just have one risk, they have multiple risks. So they're exposed to multiple stressors: poverty, poor nutrition, stress, environmental contaminants, poor health, and reduced access to health care. So all of those things work together on them. They're not one and one by itself. Okay, so what do? We do geospatial health. I'm going to talk to you about our research. If you look at this picture, you'll notice there are three layers. The very bottom layer are clinical data sets. We have geocoded the entire Duke University Medical Center database. So every time someone goes to the Duke Medical Center, we know exactly where they live, and we can map them so we can see where diseases cluster. We can see if some of these diseases cluster in areas, which they do, that are higher poverty. We can look at influences, road density, those kinds of things. The second layer are geographic data sets. So those are things like demographics, census data. And then the last one are population data sets: birth records, death records. So we combine all three of those layers. As an example, this is a national, well, that's the United States. In case you didn't know, I am a product of the US public school system geography. Yeah, I actually had to be told that was the United States. That's why they don't let me make maps. If you look at this, this shows you the disparities in birth outcomes. So this is preterm birth, percentage of preterm birth. In all of the maps I show you, the darker the color, the worse the outcome. You can see if you combine everybody, you can see the patterns. Then you look at non-Hispanic white, non-Hispanic black, and Hispanics, and you can see dramatically the racial differences in preterm birth. So that's national. Then, this is still the United States. There we are, North Carolina. What we like to do, we think national is important, but it doesn't always give us the information that we need. So we take the state of North Carolina, and then we take the county of Durham. This is one example. We do other counties in other states as well, so that we can refine our geographical scale and get richer data. So this is Durham County. You can see by looking at these where areas of higher risk are. So the darker the color, the worse the area. Some of these areas, so North Durham, if you're familiar with Durham, North Durham is not as densely populated, so some of the colors are actually not exactly right because obviously percentages deal with how many people are there. So you can see the central part right here, this is central Durham, is somewhat of a risky area. So what we decided to do is we decided to get on our feet. We assessed 22,000 tax parcels, looking at housing damage, nuisances. Do you have broken down cars in your neighborhood? Do you have drug paraphernalia on your streets? Do you have litter? On and on and on. So we looked at 60 variables for every single tax parcel by foot to look at areas that might need greater prevention or intervention. And in addition, we're looking at the resources in these areas because interventions and prevention work best when you use what's already there. Okay, so these are some more pictures. These are the percentages of the various indices that are in there. So you can see the darker colors in every single map are the same. So again, you have accumulation of risk. So as an example, let's talk about air pollution. You're talking about greening the economy. So air pollution is a big one, right? So when we look at air pollution, we look at monitors, air pollution monitors, and we also look at traffic density and distance to roadways. We know, there is no doubt, that air pollution affects health adversely. We also know that there's disproportionate exposure. So minority populations are at greater risk of exposure, and they're at greater risk, they have a higher adverse effect of this exposure. This is from the American Lung Association. They grade areas where people live. You can see the F obviously is just like in school. That's bad. You don't want an F. You can see that blacks live more often in areas that have poor air quality. Okay, so what we do, we link data. We don't only link geographically, we link across age. So on the very left side here, we get people at birth. We look at their detailed birth records. We also have the medical center data that I've told you about. We then link, so if you look at the red baby, we then link that with the blood lead screening data, and then again, we still have the health records. Then we link that same baby to elementary school, and we look at end-of-grade testing and other variables that we have, immunizations and those kinds of things. I didn't have room for adults, but you can imagine the extension. As an example of that, we're looking at lead. Just so you know, they just lowered the lead limit, which is excellent, excellent news. It used to be 10. We have shown without a doubt that blood levels of 10 lead to great intellectual deficits. They've just lowered it to 5, partially due to the work that we've done. So that's a great accomplishment. Almost as good as having 3 teenagers. Okay, looking at this picture, we all know what AIG is, right? Gifted and talented. On the bottom axis are blood lead levels. On the top axis are percentages. The red line is how many kids are in AIG with that certain blood lead level. So you can see as your blood lead level increases, it is much less likely that you're going to be in the AIG program. Similarly, LBED, Learning Behavioral Exceptionality designation, and EDO is Exceptional Designation Other. Those 2 categories are not favorable. You don't want to be in those categories. They go up as blood lead increases. Now, this is controlling for everything else. This is a schematic of what it means if you're in one of those populations, that you have all of these issues going on at the same time. This is my way of putting everything that we do for years and years in one picture. My daughter, when I told her what I had to do today, she said, "Well, just talk really fast, Mom." Okay, accumulation of deficits. We know, I've already told you, that living in disadvantaged neighborhoods affects health. We know that disadvantaged populations are more likely to have increased exposure to environmental risk. We know that these exposures interact with other factors. So again, it's not one factor, it's a factor combined with other factors. So the disadvantaged and minority populations have increased susceptibility. And we know that diet affects absorption of contaminants. In your handout, there are actually 2 extra slides that I didn't put in here because I was limited by time. But we have partnered with Bristol-Myers Squibb to look at diabetes in Durham County. So you'll notice on one of the, here, well, I'm not going to do it because there's tricky things with the IT stuff. We have, if you look at your picture, we have put every single diabetes patient on the map, and then we've overlaid resources. So if you really take a, for those of us who might be over 40, maybe, you may not be able to see that small print, so get out your magnifying glass. But you can see that we have food deserts in Durham County. I mean, in central Durham. It's crazy. If you know Durham well enough, you know that right in the middle of the highest poverty areas, there's a grocery store. What is that grocery store? Whole Foods. Not really accessible to our minority and socioeconomically disadvantaged populations. Okay, so exposure happens preconceptually. So women and men are exposed before they even conceive a child. Then you have prenatal exposure. Then you have childhood exposure. So that is a perpetuation of life course and generational disparity. We got to stop it somewhere. So setting the stage for today, which was my charge, there are racial and socioeconomic status disparities in environmental exposures. That environmental exposures differentially affect health. We If we come in healthy and with other resources, we will probably be less susceptible to adverse health effects because we have other things going for us. Disadvantaged communities accumulate multiple risks. So elucidating and eliminating these disparities in environmental exposures is critical to improving the health of all people, which is really our goal. Not some people, but all people. Okay, that's my acknowledgments. That's our website and my contact information, which is not on your acknowledgement slide. It's on the last slide on your handout. Do I have a minute for any questions? Yeah. Okay. Does anyone have any questions, in my really brief overview? Yes, sir.
In the slide on the blood lead levels, where you're saying 10 is already higher, what are the units for that?
It's deciliters per. I have to go back and look. I should know that, but I don't. Oh, it doesn't actually say. I believe it's something per deciliter. It's whatever the CDC uses. I'm sorry, I don't remember. Yes, sir. Ma'am.
When you said they lowered it from 10 to 5, who is they?
The CDC.
Okay, so national.
Yeah, it's national. Micrograms per deciliter, maybe. Any other questions? All right, well, if you have any questions or want any further information, go ahead and contact me. Oh, I forgot. I do have something else I was charged to say, and that's to welcome all the speakers this morning and this afternoon. Some of you have come from down the street. I came from literally right down the block there. Some of you came from the other color blue. We'll welcome you anyway. Some of you came from across the country, so I want to welcome you to Duke, and I hope that your day is fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have a present for you.
I told them I loved gifts. I mean, I'd like to say you didn't have to, but thank you.
You're
All right.
welcome. And I am the external managing editor for the forum, and I have the pleasure of introducing our next panel, which is entitled Broadening the Energy and Environmental Discourse, Why and How. And our moderator will be the current supervising faculty attorney and senior lecturing fellow for the Environmental Law and Policy Clinic, Michelle Nowlin. And Michelle is also currently the president of the board of directors for Toxic Free North Carolina and is a former board member of the North Carolina Conservation Network, and she currently serves as president of the Toxic Free North Carolina. She earned her dual degree in a JD and MA from Duke Law School and the Nicholas School of the Environment in 1992. And while at Duke, she was on the founding committee and was the editor-in-chief of the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Forum. So I'm pleased to welcome Michelle, who will introduce our panelists.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. And when I was a student here about 20 years ago, 2 decades ago, the Environmental Law Society organized a conference on civil rights and the environment. So it's very nice to have this come full circle and start talking about the very needed transitions to a green economy and the equitable considerations associated with that. So I'm very, very pleased to be here and appreciate the opportunity to be part of this great gathering. So I'd like to introduce the panelists for our session. Mike Rawson, and we have Caroline Farrell and Chandra Taylor. So if you all want to come up, and I'll go ahead and introduce you. I'll go in the order in which people are, provide the introductions in the order in which these folks are going to present. And because I am over 40, I am going to have to put on my reading glasses. So we have Caroline Farrell, who is the executive director of the Center on Race, Poverty, and Environment. And I had the opportunity to work with this organization a fair amount when I was at the Southern Environmental Law Center. So I'm very, very excited to be able to meet with Caroline and hear what she has to say today. She's a law graduate of Golden Gate University School of Law. and in her professional capacity works to assist low-income communities and community of color in the South Joaquin Valley in California in their struggle for environmental justice. She is one of the area's foremost environmental justice advocates and takes on such industrial polluters as agricultural facilities, industrial farms, particularly those producing cows for dairy production, hazardous waste facilities, confronting the land application of biosolids and other industrial sources of pollution. She currently serves as chair of the steering committee for the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition. I believe this is the group that has a slogan that says, "Come smell our dairy air," which I think is very funny. It's always good to have a sense of humor even when you're fighting injustice. She's a member of the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee on AB 32 for the California Air Resources Board, and also serves on the board of directors for Communities for a Better Environment and ACT for Women and Girls in Visalia. She works very hard to engage rural communities in all sorts of policy matters that would otherwise affect them, and provides a critical link between those affected communities and the policymakers so that the policies can actually be grounded in the needs and desires of the affected communities. She has written widely on structural racism, working with Luke Cole, who passed away a couple of years ago, but is one of the nation's foremost leaders on environmental justice. And she has also received the 2007 Dr. Zweig Community Health Advocate Award from the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice. It has also been named as one of OMB Watch's Rising Stars in Public Interest. Under her leadership, the Center on Race, Poverty, and Environment has won the Carla Bard Award from the California Water Policy Advocates. So we're very happy to have her here today and look forward to hearing her presentation. We also have with us today Mike Rawson, who is the co-director of the Public Interest Law Project. The Public Interest Law Project is a nonprofit state support center for the California Legal Services programs. He founded the organization in 1996 after a career serving as the manager and senior housing attorney for Legal Aid Society of Alameda County, and also directs the Public Interest Law Project's California Affordable Housing Law Project. He's had a rich career advocating for equitable housing policies throughout the region. His professional practice focuses on affordable housing, land use, redevelopment, and fair housing. He's had a fair amount of experience litigating housing-related cases with legal services programs, looking at the adequacy of local housing elements and displacement of lower-income households. This is critically important when you think about sustainable development policies, which can have the unintended consequences of gentrifying neighborhoods and displacing the people who originally lived in those communities. Most recently, he has assisted with the drafting of the land use and housing provisions of California's SB 375, which requires MPOs, metropolitan planning organizations, to adopt land use and transportation plans to shrink the regional development footprint and reduce climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. So we welcome Mike to North Carolina. Both he and Caroline traveled an awfully long way yesterday, so thank you very much for joining us. Our last speaker is Chandra Taylor, who's an attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center. It's a regional public interest law organization headquartered in Charlottesville, Virginia, but their largest office is in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I had the pleasure of working with Chandra for a few years at SCLC prior to coming to Duke, so it's very nice to have her here with us today. Her practice areas at SCLC include transportation, solid waste, water allocation, and water quality litigation, as well as policy advocacy. She is a formidable policy advocate within the North Carolina General Assembly. She serves on the boards of the Rural Empowerment Association for Community Help, the North Carolina League of Conservation Voters, and the Planning Committee of the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. She's currently developing a rural transportation advocacy agenda and examines the intersection of equity and environmental protection. She has shared her perspectives and her experience with a small group of American and Chinese environmental professionals through the Vermont Law School Environmental Justice Young Fellows China Exchange. Prior to joining SCLC, Chandra specialized in consumer protection litigation at the Financial Protection Law Center here in downtown Durham. She's a graduate of UNC, both for undergraduate studies and law school, and so we welcome Chandra with us today. So thank you very much, and we'll look forward to hearing from each of you.
So I get to go first. Again, I'm Caroline Farrell, and thank you for having me come. I wanted to share a few thoughts about how I think the principles of environmental justice and the lessons learned from the environmental justice movement can help shape a just transition to a green economy. I think at the outset we need to figure out what we want to transition to. If we're looking at only changing how we fuel the economy and what technologies we need to do that, I think we're missing an important opportunity, especially with the influx of public money and lots of private money going towards figuring out what a green economy should be. It's a perfect opportunity to use those resources to also figure out how we can solve some of the other problems associated with the fossil fuel economy besides just a limited resource pool. And I think the environmental justice movement has provided an important critique that should be utilized as a possible framework for shaping a just transition. So first I'm going to talk about a few key concepts from the environmental justice movement. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the environmental justice movement's critique of the fossil fuel economy at each cycle of the fossil fuel economy. We see disproportionate burdens on poor people and people of color. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the environmental justice movement has tried to implement solutions and interventions to change that by a few different approaches. And then I'm going to look at the case study of AB 32, which is California's Global Warming Solutions Act, which is sort of an interesting opportunity to deal with equity that is being missed on a daily basis in California, and how can we learn from that experience? So some key concepts from the environmental justice movement. I think one of the important things is that movement leaders in environmental justice have a very broad definition of environment. It is where people live and work, play, go to school, pray. So it is the intersection of natural resources and people. People are very much part of the environment. And not only how do people interact with the environment, but also how does the environment impact people? And that's an important component. So I think it's a very broad definition of the environment, besides just water, air, soil. It deals with a very kind of expansive notion. There's also a very expansive notion of what is justice. And Dr. Bullard, who is a foremost thinker on environmental justice, has, delineated at least three concepts of justice. There's distributive justice, which is where things are and what concentration burdens are placed. So as Dr. Maxson was saying, there's multiple different stressors put on people. There's several refineries concentrated in communities like in Wilmington, where they have 3 or 4 refineries. There in the San Joaquin Valley, there's several places where you've got poor water quality, poor air quality, pesticides. You've got multiple different stressors. So it's where those burdens are placed, as well as where benefits are allocated. In a lot of environmental justice communities, low-income communities and communities of color, there aren't parks. There are food deserts. There's not infrastructure, no sidewalks, no lights, no sewer. These things that we define as being important for quality of life are missing. So it's where benefits are not allocated as well as where burdens are. That deals with distributive justice. Procedural justice is another component of justice that's important. Who's at the table when decisions are made? What resources are they given to participate? And what opportunities are they given to participate in crucial decisions that are being made about what is or is not part of the transition to a more sustainable economy? And the other sort of component of justice is social justice generally. The idea that it's not just an environmental issue, but people are also impacted by not having access to power, not having access to vote, not having access to food or health care, not having the ability to have quality housing or quality transportation to get to jobs or to get to where you need to go. So it's the entire makeup of a person's life that is represented through social justice. That's an important concept. So all three aspects of justice, distributive, procedural, and social, are all encompassed within environmental justice. And I think the key differentiating factor between environmental justice and an environmental law is largely around these issues of power and how these distributive, procedural, and social justice components kind of play out in policymaking. It's not just about what the environmental target is, but how we get to that target, and who's included, and who benefits, and who doesn't benefit. That's a key component of environmental justice versus environmental law. And so taking this, how has the environmental justice movement sort of critiqued the fossil fuel economy as it exists? And I think if you look at each phase, you've got a lot of environmental justice studies and a lot of environmental justice activists working at each stage to try and improve the disparities that currently exist in the fossil fuel economy. So if you look at resource extraction, just taking resources from the ground, there's a lot of work, and I think you're going to hear more about it from mining, particularly in Appalachia and on Native American reservations. The experience that I have is with agriculture. And in the San Joaquin Valley of California, it's very much industrialized agriculture. So you're dealing with CAFOs, mostly dairies, but also some poultry CAFOs, and all of the pollution that they produce, coupled with the pesticides that are used and the aerial application of pesticides, and the fact that farm worker housing is often right adjacent to the field. So when the plane comes over, the spraying starts, and it impacts the community living right next to it. There's also some of the worst air quality in the San Joaquin is found in the San Joaquin Valley. We often rival LA for who's number one and who's number two. We have several unincorporated communities in the San Joaquin Valley who have to administer their own water systems. These are often poor Latino communities that don't have access to the technical training onto how to administer the water quality, and they don't have access to resources to upgrade their system. And what we see is farm runoff from fertilizer and pesticides creating nitrate contamination in the water systems that can't be remediated. So communities are forced to either have to buy water as well as pay their water bills. And what you see in terms of a social justice issue is many of these communities don't have grocery stores or stores in their community. So they have to drive 20 or 30 miles to the nearest store to buy the water that they need. So that's not efficient or effective. They often have no parks and no sidewalks, no sewers, as I was saying. And in terms of procedural justice, they're often not represented on the boards that are making decisions that affect their lives. These unincorporated communities are represented by counties who are often remote. Their representatives don't live in the district. We have our at-large representation, so you can live anywhere in the county and be on the board. And that leads to a disenfranchisement from decision making, especially as meetings are often held during the day when people are working, and there's no translation provided of either documents or meeting materials. So all of these things, in southern San Joaquin Valley, in sort of the resource extraction economy, are leading to disparate impacts with poor people and people of color not being part of the decisions and also bearing a lot of the pollution that those decisions lead to. So we take our ag products and we put them on trucks and we take them on the highways. And so we transport our goods, and the goods movement has been a rising issue of concern for environmental justice communities, as we see that more often than not, low-income communities and communities of color live near highways and major thoroughfares and are exposed to diesel pollution from trucks and locomotives. And we're seeing warehouses being located primarily in low-income Latino communities with a concentration of diesel pollution in those areas. And the ports. There's a lot of activity around from environmental justice groups around the Port of Long Beach and the Port of LA and the Port of Oakland. Some of the busiest ports in the United States are often located right in the middle and next to low-income communities and communities of color, who have been longtime advocates for installing new technologies that would mitigate pollution and that would ensure that communities living near ports were not adversely impacted. So this is an opportunity, I think, as we're talking about a transition to a green and just economy, is looking at what some of those solutions, technological fixes have been that have come from the community and how they can be implemented. So then we turn to some of the stationary sources like refineries, power plants, and cement kilns, glass factories, things like that. And we find that the concentration is also largely in low-income communities and communities of color. So refineries along Cancer Alley in Louisiana, and then the concentration of refineries in Wilmington, California, and Richmond, California, all low-income communities and communities of color. The workforce in these refineries largely comes from outside of the community. In Richmond, the Chevron refinery, one of the largest in the country, only 2% of their workers come from the city of Richmond. But their pollution stays in the city of Richmond. So that has both a distributive as well as a social justice impact. But interestingly enough, groups who've been working heavily in Richmond lately have received a victory in that they've changed the composition of the city council in Richmond that was once very much beholden to Chevron, and have changed it to a group of people who are more independent. And I think that's a really important step in showing that one of the key ways to prevent or to stop kind of these company townholds on communities is by engaging in the political process. And we're seeing more and more groups looking for ways to become more involved in the political and voting arena. And then finally, where the environmental justice movement started is kind of where the life cycle of things stop, which is in disposal. So the report from the United Church of Christ and a lot of Dr. Bullard's work and the movement really sparked here in North Carolina in Warren County when the state wanted to dispose of PCBs on the highways of an African American, or take PCB soil disposal that was illegally dumped along the highways and put it in a landfill in an African American community in Warren County. And that really spurred, who is living near where we're disposing of our unwanted goods and the hazardous waste pollution that we create through the fossil fuel economy. And more often than not, it's people of color. Race is the biggest predictor of whether or not you will live within 5 miles of a hazardous waste land site. And in California, all 3 hazardous waste land sites in California are in low-income Latino farm worker communities. So a just transition will ensure that these impacts are mitigated and avoided, and that the people who are facing them are at the table and figuring out how to make that happen. So how can we make that happen? And I think the environmental justice movement has really focused on kind of three key areas. One is creating public policy that at the outset includes equity at the very beginning, that the equitable outcomes are part of the policy framework. Second, that opportunities are provided for meaningful public participation, meaning that there's translation. Public meetings are held at times and locations that are convenient to the community, and that there's time given to train community members to actually meaningfully participate in those in that public policy opportunity so that they can actually substantially and substantively affect the outcome. And third is taking a holistic and preventative approach. The idea of the environmental justice movement is not to displace polluting sources to other communities. It's to figure out alternatives that are healthy for everybody, and to look at not just the environmental outcomes, but also the social justice outcomes as well, whether or not it leads to good jobs with health care, paying a living wage, and whether or not it also leads to the opportunity for more public and social engagement from the community involved. So I'm going to look at briefly a small case study of AB 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act, which California passed in 2006 to deal with climate change. And I think what's interesting about this law from an environmental justice standpoint is when it was first passed, there was a lot of excitement about it because it did two things. One, it set a target for greenhouse gas emission reductions in California. So we have to reduce to 1990 levels by 2020. But it also had some key components about how to get there. It wasn't just the target, but also in meeting that target, you needed to look at not increasing or not increasing exposure to co-pollutants. So it recognized that when you emit greenhouse gas emissions, you're also emitting things like particulate matter, toxic emissions, things that can affect the local community where the facility is sited. So as we're dealing with a global problem, we need to also pay attention to the local impacts. So that was really important. There was also language in there about not impacting low-income communities. There's language in there about maximizing the environmental benefits while you're also assessing the costs of the program. There's also language explicitly about dedicating resources to already disadvantaged communities as you're implementing AB 32. So it really focused on how we can make sure that the benefits and the burdens of this policy implementation are known as we're rolling out the policy. That is not quite being implemented. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Public participation was also another big component of AB 32. California has two open meeting laws. For the local government, it's the Brown Act, and for state government, it's the Bagley-Keene Act. So meetings around public policy decisions are open to the public, but there was some specific language in AB 32 that created an Environmental Justice Advisory Committee that I sit on, and there was it got off to a good start. One of the great things about it is the environmental justice movement in California, the leaders of the movement, were asked specifically to nominate candidates for the governor to appoint. So the environmental justice movement got to self-select who it wanted to be on and how it wanted the committee to be composed. So there was a real focus on geographic representation. So communities who are working in different geographic areas throughout the state would sit on the committee to talk about the issues and make sure that the policies were responsive to their issues. So that was a good beginning. But the problem was, from the outset, there was some disparities between the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee that the statute created and the Economic and Technical Advancement Committee. The Economic and Technical Advancement Committee had the resources of Undersecretary of Cal EPA sitting and staffing the committee, helping to get speakers, helping to arrange meetings, helping to get documents. For the Environmental Justice Committee, we had a quarter staff person helping us. We arranged all our own meetings, we got all our own speakers, and there was no transcript of anything that was discussed at the meeting. So there was no record of it except what Cal EPA gave to us as opposed to what we gave to them. So it created a real question about what seriousness this was being given. But it also created a question of, if you don't have a record, how are you going to be influencing public policy if only the people in the room at the time are actually able to hear what your recommendations are? So that was a big issue that eventually had some substantive effect, because when you look at the actual products that came out of the Air Resources Board, based on the committee's discussions, you don't see any substantive change between what was given to us and what actually was finally approved. And that led to several members of the committee joining a lawsuit against ARB over the plan that they had rolled out for how they were going to implement AB 32. And so I think it really begs the question of, you can do a lot to mitigate later discontent and litigation if you actually take positive and proactive steps to authentically listen to people during the process and make them feel like they're being heard and listened to. And a meaningful public participation process is often in the eye of the beholder. So that's an important thing to think about when you're approaching these issues. And the final thing is a holistic approach and a preventative approach. Looking for AB 32, that meant looking at the economy as a whole and looking at how changes in environmental policy may lead to job creation, job growth, and where that might be, what kind of jobs those might be. And there was a real emphasis to look at these decisions in a comprehensive way. But as I said, it didn't turn out to be the meaningful analysis. There seemed to have been the impression that a lot of people had where there were some preconceived and predetermined policy objectives that were going to be implemented regardless of what public participation was. And particularly that involved cap and trade. So I'm going to conclude just briefly with a kind of running cap and trade through this distributive procedural social justice framework and showing how this is a missed opportunity, at least in the eyes of the environmental justice community. So describe cap and trade is it's a very complicated project, but I'm going to very briefly sort of give the highlights. First, California has determined that has set a cap on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that it's going to allow industrial facilities mainly to produce. That cap is going to decrease in 3-year increments. And there are going to be allowances initially given away for free to facilities that emit greenhouse gas emissions. And then a small number will be used to be auctioned off. And the idea is that this will set a price for carbon, and that facilities can now make a choice about whether or not they want to purchase purchase allowances from each other. So facilities that can decrease their pollution are able to bank allowances that they can then sell to other facilities that can't decrease their greenhouse gas emissions. Those allowances are tradable within the state. If you can't meet, if the allowances are too expensive or there aren't enough allowances, there's a certain percentage that's allowed for offsets. And those are reductions that are either from facilities that are outside of the cap. So in this case, agriculture is out of the cap. So if a refinery in Richmond decides that allowances are too expensive or there aren't enough, then they can decide to purchase offsets, and those can be traded within the state and also without of the state. So, in just 1 minute, I'm going to talk about why that's bad. Reason is so the idea is flexibility. You're able to decide based on the price. The problem is you can't predict where the trades are going to happen. Who's going to reduce? Who's going to buy? There's no way to predict. So there's no way to determine what the equity is going to be. The facilities that are under the cap are predominantly in low-income communities and communities of color. If they decide not to if they decide to purchase allowances or offsets, they're not reducing their pollution in these already overburdened communities. And these trades are happening privately, so there's no public transparency. You don't know. And so you'll have delays in pollution reduction in communities that currently need pollution reduction, or you'll be delaying those benefits of the policy. And lastly, there's no assurance any reduction will occur. And you're not sure if the technology is not installed in the facility in your local community, those are jobs that are going someplace else. So there are jobs in maintenance, there are jobs in manufacturing, there are jobs in operations that are now going to be going someplace else where you don't know, and communities that need good green jobs aren't going to be getting them. So while we're allowing the market to decide where pollution is being reduced, it's clear that the market does not produce equity, and that we need to have some affirmative policies that do. Otherwise, I question whether we're transitioning at all, and whether it's not just the same old, we're just changing what we're burning. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. It's good that you get the two Californians out of the way real quick, because we can talk about some of the things that are going on over in the left coast. Again, my name's Mike Rawson. I'm the co-director of the Public Interest Law Project, and we are a backup center for legal services organizations in California. When a local legal services program wants to bring a big case, they want legislation adopted, they come to us and we help them get that done. We're experienced litigators and we have lobbyists in Sacramento. And I focus on affordable housing. We also do public benefits, but my focus is affordable housing. So how did we come to this conversation about how you deal with transitioning to we transition to a green economy, we're transitioning to a just economy. We came to it because we're drawn in by the latest banner of, which Carolyn talked about, the latest banner of transitioning to a green economy, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And in the land use and transportation context, that is called developing as sustainable communities. As we grow, we need to grow smaller and we need to grow cooler. And that involves a substantial change in the way we make land use decisions and the way we make decisions about who gets the transportation money. This is a good thing, growing smaller, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because there's less transportation. This is one of the three legs of the proverbial three-legged stool for how you reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation and land use sector. The first, of course, is you have more efficient vehicles, in other words, electric cars. The second is a more efficient fuel, lower carbon burning fuel. And then the third one, and the long-term one, is changing what we do when we develop. We develop closer to transportation, closer to public transportation. We do more mass transit. That's all a good thing. But you look at history, and the history of all of land use changes, major transportation changes in the country scares us. Every time there's been a major change in how we transit people in the country or do land use, who gets left out? We have poor people, persons of color. They're either excluded or they're run over. And just think of the railroads, what happened when they went in. Think of what happened during so-called urban renewal, which came to be called Negro removal, and what happened when we put in the superhighways. Every time we did that, the places those highways were built were generally through the lower income communities. The people who were displaced were generally poor people and people of color. So what we have to do is avoid that legacy in the future. And that's why I think we need to broaden the conversation of converting to a green economy, because if we don't, we're going to have continued exclusionary zoning, we're going to have continued exclusion of low-income people from the benefits of shifting to a green economy. What do we have to do? We have to mandate that there be inclusion. We have to mandate social equity, as Carolyn talked about. We have to mandate that people are included in the planning, that low-income people are included in the communities that are developed around transit, that there's affordable housing in those communities so they can live there. We have to mandate that in calculating how much real greenhouse gas emissions reductions happen from these new sustainable communities. We have to calculate the greenhouse gas that's reduced by including affordable housing and making those communities affordable. If you can't afford to live in a community, then you're going to have to commute in. And so we have to make sure that the housing that's built in these transit-oriented development is housing that's affordable to the people who work in those areas. And finally, we have to prevent the displacement of the folks who live in these, around the new transit areas and in the transit-oriented development areas, the people who are already there, and predominantly in a lot of areas where there's mass transit already, where there's you know, subway stations and bus stations, those are the lower income communities. Those are the folks that are subject to the air pollution that comes from a lot of the superhighways in that area. So we have to deal with their environmental problems that they're already having, but also make sure that the communities aren't disrupted. We have an unprecedented, I think, opportunity to change the way we think about land use and transportation planning in the country because of the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at the literature already, the literature shows that if you compact development, that's a good thing, but what's it going to do? It's going to increase land prices, and it's going to make those communities where if there's less land to develop, the prices of housing is going to go up. Price of development is going to go up. So unless you make sure that you include and mandate the inclusion of some affordability in that new development, people are going to be excluded and people are going to be displaced. So I'm going to briefly outline, from the California perspective, what's happening with the California Sustainable Communities legislation. We're going to talk a little bit about the ancillary federal legislation, which primarily focuses on funding. There's federal funding from HUD for sustainable communities, and there's, of course, the funding from the Department of Transportation. We're going to then look at the experience of California to date in implementing the sustainable communities legislation. And finally, we're going to focus on fair housing and civil rights laws and how those laws are implicated in the move to sustainable communities, and how those laws provide tools for advocates to make sure that instead of exclusion of poor people and persons of color, we get inclusion. So back to California and California's dreaming. As Carolyn talked about, we have AB 32, which said by the year 2020, we have to reduce our GHG levels, greenhouse gas levels, to the 1990 levels. It's 2012 now. I don't think we're going to make it, but that was the aspiration. Carolyn talked about many of the problems. In 2008, the legislature adopted SB 375, which was the land use and transportation prong of AB 32. It's the implementation prong for the land use and transportation sector. And basically what it said is that in every region in the country, you have to do a regional transportation plan if you're going to get money from the Department of Transportation. And so what the California legislation says is that in your regional transportation plan, you have to include a sustainable community strategy. And that sustainable community strategy must describe a shrunken development footprint so that as we grow in the future, we grow smaller. How do they do that? They do that by latching on to California's fair share housing requirements. Like a lot of states, I'm not sure North Carolina, but a lot of states, there's an obligation to have, for each community to take it on its fair share of the affordable housing needs for the region over a period of time. And in California, it's known as the Housing Element Law. Every 5 years, each community in California gets an allocation of what its affordable housing need is going to be over the next 5 years. And then that community has the obligation to plan for those needs. They have to rezone sites to high densities, and they have to make those sites available for affordable housing development. What SB 375 did is it says, okay, when you do that allocation is going to be weighted, and the fair share housing needs are going to be directed towards transportation corridors and mass transit areas. But surprise, what was left out? What was left out was a consideration of what are the impacts of that new weighting? What's that going to do to the folks who already live in those communities? And what about the folks who live in communities that don't happen to be near transportation corridors, don't happen to be near mass transit or planned mass transit? What about those people? They often live in communities where there isn't affordable housing. And yet the need for affordable housing is going to be shifted to these transit areas. And so there'll be less incentive and less obligation of local governments outside that development footprint to do affordable housing. That wasn't considered. The advocates, some of us who were involved in the drafting, tried to get the legislature to consider that, But in order to get this huge land use planning and transportation bill passed, you have to get all the stakeholders to agree, and so you end up with, you know, like you always end up with legislation, just a piece of sausage. Some good parts and some fatty parts. The role of federal government. Federal government primarily in sustainable communities plays a monetary role. The Department of Housing and Community Development has sustainable communities regional planning grants that they give out to these regions to do this new land use planning. The Department of Transportation, of course, is the entity that provides the federal transportation dollars that will be used to fund, we hope, the mass transit and the transit centers that will facilitate sustainable communities development. And as I mentioned, the way this is all tied together in California is that when the regional transportation plans are done by the regions, which is required by the Department of Transportation in order to get the transportation money, they have to have a sustainable communities plan in them in California. So what's the reality in California? How have things played out in the beginning implementation of SB 375? Carolyn has talked about the problems with the implementation of the overarching AB 32. In implementing SB 375, the early returns are mixed. All regions, thankfully, there have emerged strong coalitions of environmental activists, affordable housing activists, and other social activists to pressure the regional governments to include social equity in their planning of sustainable communities. In Sacramento, my co-author, Mona Tawatau, who couldn't be here today because as we speak, she's arguing in court in Folsom, California to try to save their affordable inclusionary zoning law. She has worked with a group called CORE, that's a Coalition on Regional Equity, and they have put a lot of pressure on the regional government in Sacramento to use social equity when they determine where the sustainable communities are going to be. And they've been successful. They have done a social equity plan, and the social equity plan has identified the priority transit communities where development will be focused, and they've identified both vulnerable communities and high opportunity communities. Vulnerable communities being communities like the ones that Carolyn described, where predominantly low income, persons of color, no infrastructure, communities that unless they're protected are going to be run over by sustainable communities development. And they've identified the high opportunity communities. Those are the communities where the jobs are, where the good schools are, and where the nicer neighborhoods are. And the concept is that you have to link those two, and you have to make sure on the one hand that the lower income communities are not excluded from the whole process and there's not displacement. And on the other hand, you have to make sure that those folks get on the public transportation and get to the higher opportunity communities. Turning to the Bay Area, they have a little different experience, not as good as Sacramento. The Association of Bay Area Governments, the regional government there, has come up with a plan the way they're going to implement the State of Sustainable Communities strategy is they're going to take the fair share housing needs, the regional housing needs that each community gets, and they're going to weight them for transit-oriented development in transit priority areas. As far as that goes, that's good. But how are they going to decide where those allocations are going to be made? At this point, they've decided when jurisdictions volunteer, after they identify a universe of where the good transit areas are, where the areas for new development should be, if you're going to get a weighted allocation of fair share housing need, the jurisdiction has to volunteer. Now this kind of abrogates the concept of planning, because instead of planning where the housing should be and where it's really needed, where it's going to be is where jurisdictions who decide they want to have a greater housing presence volunteer for it. And it's kind of crazy because generally in California, jurisdictions don't want to get this housing need because that means they have to zone sites for affordable housing development, and they don't want to do that generally. So when you add the volunteering aspect to the whole thing, what happens is that only the jurisdictions that think, yeah, maybe if we volunteer, we'll get a little extra transportation money, and we can build the BART station or the transit station that we want. That's not the way to plan. That's sort of supply side planning, and it's not going to work. So, but that's where they're going at this point, and it's probably not legal, at least from our standpoint. And they did not do a social equity analysis when they came up with this, as you might have imagined. If they did, they might not have adopted this voluntary program. Why didn't they do that? Why did Sacramento? The reason was Sacramento got a HUD regional planning grant. And coming with that money is the obligation to do a social equity analysis. That's why they did it in Sacramento. They had the money for it, and they had to do it to get the money. San Francisco didn't get one of those grants. They have one for the next period coming up, but they didn't have one, so they didn't do the social equity analysis. So they left out the folks who are generally left out. What are the legal ramifications of all this? Well, what do the civil rights laws and fair housing laws have to say about it? Well, they have to say a lot, but there's not a lot of awareness of how these laws implicate environmental justice and sustainable community planning. The principal laws that are implicated are the Fair Housing Act and Title VI. Fair Housing Act is Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, and I have 5 minutes. And it's at 42 U.S.C. 3601 at sec. And then Title VI is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it's at 42 U.S.C. 2000D. Both of these laws require recipients of federal money to certify that they're not going to discriminate against persons protected by the fair housing laws. Both of these laws, and they have to certify that before they get any money. Both of these laws say that define discrimination, not just as intentional discrimination against those folks, but as an action or inaction that has a disparate impact on the persons protected. So if the action taken by a regional government to steer sustainable community development to one area is going to disproportionately affect a minority community, disproportionately affect families with children or persons with disabilities for that matter, that is going to be a facial violation of the Fair Housing laws. Both Title VI and Title VIII, Fair Housing Act, say that that is discrimination and you can't do that. And both these laws have regulations which, when implemented, require social equity analysis of some kind in both the transportation planning decisions and the land use planning decisions. Now, a caveat on this discriminatory effect method of proof is that before the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court right now in this term is Magner versus Gallagher. That is a case that will decide how and if you can use discriminatory effect method of proof in fair housing cases. We think probably discriminatory effect method of proof will survive, but there'll be some uniformity applied to how you have to carry out your proof. 11 circuits all recognize the discriminatory effect method of proof, but they all have different standards. Let's quickly turn to some examples of how these civil rights laws have been used, both in the land use context and in the transportation context. First, Westchester County, New York. Affluent county, above New York City, but it's pockets of poverty, pockets of African-American residents. Every county in the country receives federal money from HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development, for community development block grants. Every county gets it. And to get this money, they have to certify that they are affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is 42 U.S.C. 3608. It's part of the Fair Housing Act. And the way they certify that is they say, we have done an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. And they certify that they do that, then they get the money. And every community that gets CDBG funds in the country does that. Well, Westchester County didn't do that. They didn't do their analysis of impediments. They used other studies that were already in existence, but they didn't do that. Yet they certified that they had to do it, that they had done it. So the Anti-Discrimination Center in in New York brought a False Claims Act suit saying, you said you were going to do this and you got your federal money, but you didn't do it. And what happened was they went to summary judgment, and the U.S., the Department of Justice decided not to come in on the case at that stage. In a False Claims Act, they get the opportunity to do that. They didn't come in, but the Anti-Discrimination Center won in summary judgment. Then the U.S. Department of Justice came in and helped settle the case. What was the settlement? Chester County had to return $30 million to HUD. They had to put $21.6 million into the development of affordable housing in high opportunity communities in Westchester County that would be available to the folks that live in the low opportunity communities. They had to pay a relator share to the folks who blew the whistle on them of $7.5 million, and they had to pay attorney's fees of $2.5 million. And this was done by the Anti-Discrimination Center in New York, and helped out immensely by Relman and Dane, which is a fair housing law firm in DC. 2 minutes. I think we're going to make it. Let's go back to the left coast and focus on civil rights and transportation planning. The Bay Area Rapid Transit wanted to do an extension of the BART system, their regional public transportation subway system, from the Oakland Coliseum BART station to the Oakland Airport. Coliseum is where the A's play and the Raiders play. What they'd done, and it's proximate to the airport, what they'd done previously is they had bus services that ran through East Oakland, which is predominantly Latino and African American. But this BART extension was going to be, it was going to bypass all that and go right to the airport, and they were going to stop the bus service. They were getting, through the Department of Transportation, stimulus money to do this, $71 million in stimulus money. So the writers brought an administrative action with the Federal Transportation Administration saying, wait a minute, you haven't done the social equity analysis that the regulations that govern, the Title VI regulations that govern use of Department of Transportation money. You haven't done that social equity analysis. And if you had, you would have seen that you're cutting out a vital source of transportation for this disenfranchised community. And the FTA, Federal Transportation Administration, agreed. They did a civil rights compliance analysis, and they said, you're right. They didn't do that social equity analysis, so they yanked the money. They took $71 million away from BART. Now, BART is still going ahead with the extension because they found some money somewhere else, and everybody really wants that extension. But this shows you the power of using the civil rights laws to make sure that in the future we're going to have, as we move forward and grow cooler and have sustainable communities, we can use the civil rights laws to ensure that the low-income communities don't get cut out and that they're actually included in growing cooler. Communities that are not affordable are not sustainable communities. Even whether you look at it from an environmental standpoint or a social justice standpoint, social equity standpoint. The communities are going to be sustainable, they got to be affordable, and they got to be inclusive. And I'll stop there.
Good morning. Again, my name is Chandra Taylor. I'm an attorney at Southern Environmental Law Center. I'm going to be speaking with you about transportation. So thinking about what can we do with transportation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, what considerations need to be made on the state level, and also thinking about how do we include rural communities in particular, and thinking about what can happen in changes to transportation policy to get better results for the environment and for the people that live in rural communities as well as urban communities. This report that I'm going to be speaking with you about was published in 2009 by SCLC, and we have worked to do updates on it. I will provide, there's a hard copy available. I'll move it up here at the end of the talk. But it's also available from the Southern Environmental Law Center website. So if you were interested in looking at the contents in more detail, you can check it out that way. At any rate, The percentage of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector in 2009 was 27.5%. The most recent estimates that I've seen is that it's risen to about 29%. So what we do with transportation affects our environment. So we want to do better. We want to grow smaller. We want to grow cooler. SCLC has provided 5 policy recommendations to get us to a better place, to look at a better transportation future. And these are the 5 recommendations: project prioritization, Department of Transportation board and agency reform, increasing transportation choice, linking transportation to land use, and fixing what we have first. So, project prioritization. So this is basically about how do we determine how we spend the limited resources that we have available. Over the next 25 years, the Department of Transportation sees they have $120 billion worth of projects that are expected to be constructed. The revenues for that same period are less than half of that amount. How should the department, how should the state go about deciding what projects get prioritized? We have said, as you can see here, that we need to establish in law an objective, transparent system to prioritize spending of our limited transportation dollars based on demonstrated ability to meet established criteria for mobility, economic development, and environmental stewardship. So it's really important that these projects aren't getting selected based on someone who has a lot of influence wanting a particular project in a particular place, but rather statewide policies that benefit the entire state. So there's some other states here I've listed that have laws on project prioritization to look to: South Carolina, Delaware, Indiana, and Washington. It's not good enough just to have the law on the books, but actually to make it work. North Carolina at this stage has an agency project prioritization effort going forward. It's called Prioritization 2.0. We have commented on it, and it can still get better. They're moving away from just looking at congestion relief to some of these other more important, we think, factors, including environmental stewardship, economic development. The next policy recommendation is DOT board and agency reform. In our state right now, we have a very large transportation board. There are 19 members on the current board of transportation. 14 come from the 14 transportation districts. 5 are specific policy positions. Now, when current Governor Beverly Perdue came into office, she issued an executive order that said, basically, we're going to take politics out of how transportation decisions are made, but we have to go beyond her executive order. This is a map that you see of our transportation board districts in the state of North Carolina. So there are 14. They're actually based on an old system of where prisons would go and have their workers build. It has no meaningful relation to transportation planning. So, I mean, there's a flaw right there. Now, and you think about what this transportation board does. They're making decisions about where this huge amount of money gets to go. So the governor says, we're going to stop having you determine that you're going to advocate for your random transportation district. You should be thinking about the entire state. But we have advocated in the past, and the Governor's Logistics Task Force has actually made a preliminary recommendation to reduce the number of transportation districts to focus on the 7 economic development regions of the state. Now, that is a preliminary recommendation. We will see if it actually moves forward. The economic development regions of the state are a bit more appropriate because the economic development regions of the state allow for some regional thought about where our transportation board members come from. And if we think about metropolitan planning organizations, regional transportation planning, the idea of having a smaller number of board representatives who are not in put together in a way that really is not very logical. We'd like to move away from that, and there's the thought that that will happen and that the policy seats will remain on the Board of Transportation. In addition to board changes, there's also agency changes. There was a huge $2.5 million study by a consultant group called McKinsey that went through what does the agency need to do to become better. One of those recommendations was coordination with other agencies. So when you're thinking about a transportation project, you should be talking with housing people. You should be talking to the Department of Environment and Natural Resources about the transportation project. We want the best transportation project. We want them not to be wasteful, and they should be considering the impacts on the environment. It should be considering how these transportation projects affect available housing. So moving on to the third recommendation of the report, we think there should be an improvement in the amount of transportation choice, increasing multimodal options. So our specific recommendation in 2009 was to establish by law an adequate funding mechanism for a multimodal transportation system, including transit, bike, and pedestrian mobility options. This also included, for intercity transport, increased investment in passenger and freight rail. So there's been progress since 2009. There was the passage of the intermodal bill, which was, it was huge. So this is the bill that allows any county in the state of North Carolina to raise money specifically for transit. It gets put on the ballot if the Board of County Commissioners, whatever board that has the authority to put the measure on the ballot, can get put on the ballot, and then the citizens will vote whether or not they'd like to be taxed an additional amount just to provide transit. Just this past year in 2011, you all probably know that Durham did have a successful referendum. Some of you may have voted. It was available on the ballot for those who did vote. And if Wake and Orange counties also pass the same referendum, then this vision for a regional transportation system that includes light rail and commuter rail can go forward. But the fact that it exists is really important. It allows rural counties that have more rural populations could also determine that they would like to raise money specifically for transit, expansion of it. The funding mechanism is there for people to raise the money themselves, but there's still grant provisions within that law that are unfunded. There's still other issues regarding transportation choice that we're grappling with. In the last session, there was an attempt to give back over $500 million of federal money that was awarded to this state to expand rail. Now, this is the map that shows the emerging mega regions of the United States. So we are right now in the Piedmont-Atlanta mega region. It's the concept that we're growing in a way that is regional and that we need to provide what we can get from it is that in order to provide for the people that will come here in a way that is not going to increase congestion, we'd want to provide transportation in ways other than just the automobile, so that we're not trying to drive into a city center from a sprawling community. Lots of times, as you know, people, in order to afford the place that they want to live, they drive out for it. You know, if they have a certain job in X place, the most affordable housing may be quite a distance away. So people, drive till they qualify. And that's creating sprawl. It's also creating, their air pollution issues that go along with it. But since we're acknowledging that we're growing in this way, we have to do something more creative, more innovative about it. This is the Southeast High-Speed Rail Corridor, getting back to the funding that North Carolina has to expand our rail. The money's here. The effort to give it back did not succeed, but the fact that that is something that could happen on the state level is it's something of concern, and it's a constant uphill battle to find additional funding to expand multimodal options. But it is one of the transportation recommendations to do something more appropriate for our state as we grow. You've heard during the course of the day something already about linking transportation and land use, but if we grow out, then people are still driving to get to where they need to go. The effort to link transportation and land use is about building in the existing footprint, making housing available in the existing footprint. One of the things that we saw, this is a 1950 to 2000 graph showing how the land development is outpacing population growth. So the orange bars are showing the population, the yellow bars are showing how much area people have to actually, the developed area. So as you can see, the development of the land area is quickly outpacing the population. People are moving. We need to deal with where people go, how they grow, how we grow. Another example of coordinating land use and transportation planning has to do with consolidating the metropolitan planning organizations. Whenever after the census, so we have a 2010 census, the governor can ask that metropolitan planning organizations reconsider their boundaries. This map shows you the area that is the greater Charlotte area. So in that area, there are 4 different metropolitan planning organizations. These are the planners who are deciding what are our transportation investments going to be, how are we going to set about getting them, where in fact we know, based on this whole area, all of the area in gray, that this is a region that people are, they're working and living in the same region. They're coming into Charlotte to work from all of these counties, and it would make more sense to plan as one unit instead of having 4 different metropolitan planning organizations to have one. It can happen, it hasn't happened yet, but if we can better link land use and transportation planning, we could get there. The last policy recommendation I'm going to talk about to you today is fixing what we have first. So making sure that we have adequate funds set aside to take care of the maintenance needs and repairs that need to get done now. And that's going to turn to the whole question of what is it that we prioritize? How do we deal with the fact that we don't have enough money to build out what we'd like to see done? And what are the best places to spend the money? There are many deficient bridges in the state of North Carolina. The darkest areas show where there are the most deficient bridges, but each of our counties has a number of deficient bridges. We can, by statute, make a decision to devote a certain amount of transportation funding just to maintenance and repair. The state of Virginia, in 3 years, will not have additional money for new construction. Their budget will be going to maintenance and repair, and they'll have to figure out other ways to fund new construction. As you can see between these pie charts, North Carolina is devoting a lesser amount to maintenance and repair and more to new construction, but we don't have enough money to build out what people have determined they'd like to build out. We need to do something different. Turning to rural America and rural North Carolina. Now, Durham, North Carolina is my second hometown, but Kinston, North Carolina is my first. So I'm from rural North Carolina. This is an area that I care a great deal about. And when we think about broadening this transition to a greener economy, we're thinking about what is it that lower income communities need? What is it that communities that may be left out of the debate sometimes, what is actually needed? What happens right now in this state, as you can see, the green areas on this map, those are rural counties. 85 of North Carolina's 100 counties are rural. Still, most of the population lives in the gray counties. So the green turquoise are the rural counties, the gray are the urban counties. Most of the commerce happens in the gray counties, but there's still people, there's still valuable farmland. We have to consider what's going on in these rural areas. Rural areas are often lower income. Rural areas often have higher numbers of disabled people, higher numbers of elderly people, higher numbers of people of color. And right now, the big effort is to continue to build bypasses of rural communities, whether or not we need them. There are declining populations. If you look at that middle map, you can maybe see the gray areas. Those are the communities that have declining populations in the last decade in the state of North Carolina. Now, if we have a better transportation system for rural areas, rural areas can benefit from being able to transport agricultural goods, and people can have a higher quality of life. We need to reconsider bypassing rural North Carolina. When you put in a road, this map is a system of the Super 70 project that's currently being pursued by the North Carolina Department of Transportation and the Super 70 Commission. It's a system of bypasses of lots of small towns heading down to Morehead City. Now, each of these small towns and the businesses along these routes, they get bypassed. So traffic that might go through to stop to engage in commerce will no longer do that. It makes it easier for people to get down to tourism and recreation. Some would say that it would make it easier to have some economic development down at the port of Morehead City, but the environmental impact statement, the draft, does not bear that out. It just has a bare statement that that is what happens. I think it should be analyzed a bit more carefully. One of the recommendations that we're making, and that makes sense, is a focus on safety and maintenance. Rural roads have a much higher rate of fatality in traffic accidents. So if you're in a rural area and you get in an accident, it's much more likely that there will be a fatality than if you are in a more urban area. And a lot of these reasons have to do with a lack of desirable safety features on these rural roads. The repairs to rural roads cost a great deal less than investing in another 4-lane road, investing in another bypass, when the fact is that the congestion issues aren't there in rural areas. We have to think of better ways to spend the money, and it might not be the most expensive way. There may be other ways to actually have a more vibrant rural North Carolina, more vibrant rural America, than to build a system of bypasses of these areas. These are the transportation recommendations, and that's one of the major considerations. How do we think about how we spend money in rural areas, especially when right now the available funds are being used to build additional 4-lane roads, additional bypasses. So I am working on right now a white paper to develop this idea, and considering what rural North Carolina could have. So again, I have the reports here. They're available on SCLC's website, and thank you for your attention.
I think we have a few minutes for questions. This panel got a little bit of a late start, so I'll ask the, 8 minutes? Okay, good, thank you. So, are there any questions from the audience? Yes.
When it comes to Chandra, when it comes to bypassing these rural communities downtown, what kind of effects does that have on small businesses, low-income populations, and populations of color?
Well, so I know, because I've done the research recently on small businesses, is that often if a small business is bypassed, they're much less likely to relocate somewhere else. So they're just shut down. And to the extent that those businesses are providing employment for people who are living in those towns, that's another lost opportunity. There are already higher numbers of people of color and low-income communities. Rural North Carolina has lost the textile industry. There are already fewer jobs. So if you shut down the small business, where are people going to work in town? They're left trying to find transportation to somewhere that's much further away. And how are they going to get there? And how much of their transportation budget is going to be spent trying to get to employment that maybe is 30 minutes away or an hour away from where they live?
Ms. Page.
Just out of curiosity, if congestion's not an issue, what's driving the Super 70 project? And the money could be used elsewhere. Is it just getting people down to Morehead City, or what's driving the?
So your question has two elements. Can it be used in other places? That's one of the problems. So thinking about how transportation funding can be spent, right now, people think that it can only be spent on roads, and in a lot of situations, that is the only thing that it can be spent on. We have to do something to change how transportation funding can be spent. So, and these roads, a lot of them are in plans that are very old. So transportation planning happens several years out. So these roads are built in, and people are saying, we have this money. The only way that we can spend it is on these roads, so, well, we should do it. But then there's this idea that it will create economic development, and it is not supported by detailed studies. So there's a group of professionals who, I respect a number of these professionals, and I want economic development for Eastern North Carolina. But if you look at I think it's like a 30-page report, you just don't see it. Morehead City is a small port. It's not going to be able to expand much farther. There was a concern when Highway 40 was built that the part of Eastern North Carolina that's now considering Super 70, that they didn't get the benefit of whatever Highway 40 created. And what you can see when you look at Highway 40 is that, well, you can get from Raleigh down to Wilmington. Wilmington has a lot of people, and there are things there going on that are positive in economic development, but there's still all the communities in between. There's still all the confined animal feeding operations in between. It's not like there's this booming economy that happened between Raleigh and Wilmington that resulted from Highway 40, but yet there are still people who say we need to do this because, well, it's in the plan, we get money, we have to spend it, and maybe it's going to generate some economic development.
Maria.
Great panel. Thanks so much for traveling far and near to talk about ways that we bring social justice issues into the conversation. And we look at different ways that can happen in your fields. And Carolyn, AB 32 was sort of held up as a model of a way to deal with climate change while bringing in the EJ community, and it didn't work out. Michael, you talked about the social equity analysis that comes out of federal law that is required for these development projects. And I'm just wondering, as we're looking at these issues, what kind of overarching possibilities are there for including EJ in the conversation? And specifically, what looking back at AB 32 and the way it was formulated, was it just the funding mechanism that was left out of the committee that kind of created the disparity? Should we be trying to come up with equity analysis reports and demanding that in all of these situations?
Well, I think in AB 32, there was, the funding was more of a symptom than a cause, I think. I think there was a real push by traditional environmental groups to really address climate change. And I think when the bill was being negotiated, they saw that unless equity was a part of the bill, environmental justice groups may not be supportive. And then there would be a division in the environmental movement on climate change, which they couldn't afford with the Republican senators and assembly people in California. So there was a real inclusiveness to EJ at the time to get bill language, but I'm not sure the motivation beyond just, well, let's get it passed, was there. And I think what we need to do a lot more of is building traditional environmental groups up into becoming advocates for environmental justice in a real way. And part of that is really building up the community organizing piece and getting grassroots mobilization and really creating, I think one of the problems at the federal level too, in terms of getting climate change policy at the federal level, was there was no real grassroots support for it. And so how do you build the grassroots support? And that support is going to, what we're hearing from communities is equity needs to be a part of it. And the less and less it is, and the less and less groups are held accountable to that, the more problems I think we're going to have.
But you have to create a system where you're not just getting lip service, you're
Exactly.
getting results, you're getting true partnership.
Right.
I think, just let me say a couple of things. I think part of the problem is in the legislation itself and the need for it to be passed and trying to get the stakeholders to agree. And so you end up with something that that maybe doesn't have the social equity pieces we need and the specificity to get it implemented. But the difference between AB 32 and what happened with that in SB 375 is that because SB 375 focused on land use and transportation, which is implemented on a regional level, and there are regional governments that did that, it was easier for coalitions of advocates to form around that because there was already a region and you could have a coalition get together in each region. Whereas for AB 32, it's a statewide piece and it's sort of amorphous of how do you organize folks around that. It's become easier because there's the regional focus on the land use and transportation. I think there's also a role for the federal government, as I described with the civil rights laws, but Chandra just emailed me last night something that I think is very significant. And it's we have it only because of the administration we have now. In the decision by the Department of Transportation of how they allocate money for mass transit, they've changed their regulations. So they proposed changing their regulations. It used to be the touchstone for allocating mass transit dollars was to look at how were commute times lessened, and they didn't look at what is the cost of the ticket on the BART train? What is the cost of the mass transit? Is it just going to be for affluent folks? They've changed that touchstone, and the touchstone, at least one of the touchstones, is now going to be what is the cost of the transportation? Not how does it shorten the transportation times, but is it affordable? And it's that kind of federal legislation tied to the federal dollars, because implementing AB 32 and implementing SB 375 in California doesn't happen unless there's without the federal transportation money. So I think there's a big role for the federal government to play there to steer us towards using social equity considerations, the cost of transportation and the cost of housing in our decisions on redevelopment.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a really interesting panel, and we appreciate your contributions to the discussion today. Thank you.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.